The encrypted message arrived at Senator Marco Rubio's secure phone at 3:47 a.m. "Your wife, your children, they are not safe. Stop the hearing or they disappear." It was signed with the symbol of the Sinaloa Cartel. Most politicians would have called the FBI immediately, but Rubio had been expecting this threat for weeks, and his response would not only save his family but destroy the most powerful drug empire in the Western Hemisphere. The night was still dark outside his Coral Gables home when the secure satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message that would change everything. Senator Marco Rubio had been sleeping fitfully, his mind already focused on the high-stakes Senate hearing scheduled for later that morning. For months he had been building a case against the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the Americas, gathering evidence that would expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of government, business and law enforcement on both sides of the border. The Sinaloa Cartel had operated with impunity for decades, moving billions of dollars worth of narcotics into American cities while corrupting officials and eliminating anyone who dared to stand in their way. But Marco Rubio was not just anyone, and he had been preparing for this confrontation far longer than the cartel leadership realized. The senator's involvement in the anti-cartel investigation had begun 18 months earlier, when a DEA agent named Patricia Rodriguez had approached him through carefully arranged back channels. Rodriguez had spent 7 years working undercover operations against Mexican drug organizations, and she had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy so vast and so deeply embedded in legitimate institutions that traditional law enforcement approaches had proven completely inadequate. The cartels had evolved far beyond simple drug trafficking operations. They had become sophisticated multinational corporations with advanced technology, professional management structures, and intelligence capabilities that rivaled those of nation-states. More disturbing still, they had systematically corrupted officials throughout the American government, from local police departments to federal agencies, creating a network of protection that made them virtually untouchable through conventional prosecution methods. Rodriguez had brought Rubio a thick folder containing bank records, intercepted communications, surveillance photographs, and testimony from witnesses who had agreed to cooperate only under the promise of the highest levels of government protection. The evidence painted a picture of an organization that had infiltrated American financial institutions, corrupted immigration officials, and established sophisticated money laundering operations that moved drug profits through legitimate businesses across multiple countries. But the most shocking revelation was the identity of the man who controlled it all. Eduardo Valdez had built the modern Sinaloa Cartel from a regional drug trafficking operation into a global criminal empire worth an estimated $40 billion. Unlike the flamboyant cartel leaders of previous generations, Valdez operated with the discretion and sophistication of a fortune. He lived quietly in a heavily fortified compound outside Culiacan, rarely appearing in public and maintaining his operations through a carefully structured hierarchy of lieutenants and front company. American law enforcement agencies had been trying to build a case against Valdez for over a decade, but he had consistently remained one step ahead of their efforts. His organization had penetrated law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border, providing him with advance warning of raids, investigations, and arrest warrants. Several federal agents who had gotten too close to exposing his operations had been murdered, their deaths made to look like accidents or random crimes. Others had simply disappeared, their bodies never found. It was this pattern of corruption and violence that had convinced Rodriguez to approach Rubio directly. The DEA agent had become convinced that the only way to bring down Valdez was through a coordinated political and law enforcement operation that would expose his network publicly while simultaneously executing arrests and asset seizures across multiple jurisdictions. She needed a politician with the credibility, resources, and courage to take on such a dangerous adversary. And Marco Rubio had proven over his Senate career that he was willing to confront powerful enemies when American interests were at stake. The senator had listened carefully to Rodriguez's presentation, asking detailed questions about the evidence and the proposed operation. He understood immediately that agreeing to lead this effort would put him and his family at enormous risk. The Sinaloa Cartel had a long history of retaliating against anyone who threatened their operations, and they had demonstrated repeatedly that they considered no target off limits. Politicians, judges, journalists, and law enforcement officers who had opposed them had been murdered with shocking brutality, often along with their families. But Rubio also understood that someone had to take the risk. The cartel's operations were poisoning American communities, fueling addiction epidemics, and corrupting democratic institutions. Every month that Valdez remained free, more young Americans died from overdoses, more communities were destroyed by drug-related violence, and more public officials were compromised by cartel money. The senator had built his political career on the principle that America's leaders must be willing to confront difficult challenges, regardless of personal cost, and this situation represented exactly the kind of tests that would define his legacy. After careful consideration and consultation with his family, Rubio had agreed to work with Rodriguez on developing a strategy that would expose the Sinaloa Cartel's operations while protecting the witnesses and evidence needed for successful prosecution. They had spent months planning every detail of the operation, coordinating with federal agencies, international partners, and congressional leadership to ensure that when they moved against Valdez, it would be swift, comprehensive, and decisive. The plan centered around a high-profile Senate hearing that would publicly present the evidence against the cartel while providing cover for simultaneous law enforcement operations across multiple countries. Rubio would use his position as chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs to call witnesses, present documents, and create an official record that could be used in subsequent criminal prosecution. At the same time, DEA, FBI, and Mexican federal agents would execute coordinated raids designed to capture key cartel leaders and seize their assets before they could flee or destroy evidence. The timing would be crucial. The hearing had to begin before Valdez realized what was happening, but the law enforcement operations had to be ready to move immediately once the evidence became public. One leaked detail, one compromised official, one security breach could result in the escape of the targets and the murder of everyone involved in the operation. Rodriguez had impressed upon Rubio that they would get only one chance to succeed, and failure would likely be fatal for everyone who had participated. As the date of the hearing approached, Rubio had implemented extraordinary security measures for his family. His wife and children had been quietly relocated to a safe house under round-the-clock protection by a special detail of U.S. Marshals who had been briefed on the nature of the threat. His own movements had been restricted, and his daily routines altered to minimize predictable patterns that could be exploited by cartel surveillance teams. Every communication was encrypted, every meeting location was swept for listening devices, and every document was secured in facilities that met the highest classification standards. Despite these precautions, Rubio had known that the cartel would eventually discover what he was planning and would attempt to stop him through intimidation or violence. Eduardo Valdez had not built his empire by allowing threats to his organization go unanswered, and the senator represented the most serious challenge the cartel leader had faced in his criminal career. The encrypted message that arrived at 3:47 a.m. was exactly what Rubio had been expecting, though the directness of the threat still sent a chill down his spine as he read the words on his secure phone screen. "Your wife, your children, they are not safe. Stop the hearing or they disappear." The message was signed with the distinctive symbol of the Sinaloa Cartel, a stylized eagle that Valdez used to mark his most important communications. The threat was unambiguous and deadly serious. Most politicians who received such a message would have immediately contacted the FBI, cancelled the hearing, and disappeared into witness protection until the situation could be resolved through other means. But Marco Rubio was not most politicians, and this threat represented exactly the moment he had been preparing for throughout the long months of investigation and planning. Instead of calling for help, Rubio reached for a different phone, a specially encrypted device that connected him directly to DEA agent Rodriguez. The call was answered on the first ring, indicating that Rodriguez had been expecting contact at any hour of the night. "They made contact," Rubio said simply, reading the threat message aloud to Rodriguez. "This confirms that our security measures have been effective. They're worried enough to risk exposing themselves with a direct threat, which means they don't have detailed intelligence about our actual preparation." Rodriguez had been monitoring cartel communications for weeks, watching for any sign that they had discovered the scope of the operation being planned against them. The fact that they were resorting to crude intimidation tactics suggested that their intelligence about the hearing was limited to what had been made public through normal congressional channels. If they had known about the coordinated law enforcement operations or the evidence that would be presented, they would have simply attempted to kill everyone involved rather than trying to negotiate through threats. "This is actually good news," Rodriguez told Rubio. "It means we still have operational security, and it gives us the opportunity to use their threat against them. Are you ready to execute the backup plan we discussed?" The backup plan was a sophisticated counterintelligence operation that would use the cartel's own threat as bait to draw them into a trap. Instead of canceling the hearing or calling for protective measures, Rubio would appear to negotiate with the cartel while actually providing law enforcement with the opportunity to track their communications and identify their sources within the United States. It was an extremely dangerous strategy that required Rubio to put himself at enormous personal risk, but it offered the best chance of capturing not just Valdez, but the entire network of corrupted officials who had protected his operations for so many years. "I'm ready," Rubio confirmed. "Let's destroy these bastards." Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over Miami and the rest of the political world began preparing for what they assumed would be a routine congressional hearing, Rubio and Rodriguez implemented a plan that had been months in the making. The senator sent a carefully crafted response to the cartel threat, indicating that he was willing to discuss modifying the hearing in exchange for assurances about his family's safety. The message was designed to appear genuine while actually providing federal agents with the ability to monitor cartel communications and trace their operational networks. At the same time, law enforcement teams across 3 countries moved into position for coordinated operations that would begin the moment Rubio started presenting evidence at the hearing. DEA agents prepared to raid cartel safehouses and financial operations across the American Southwest. Mexican federal police positioned themselves outside Valdez's compound in Sinaloa. FBI teams prepared to arrest the corrupted American officials whose names appeared on Rodriguez's evidence files. Banking regulators prepared to freeze accounts and seize assets in multiple countries. Immigration officials prepared to detain cartel operatives who had been using fraudulent documents to cross borders. The scale and complexity of the operation was unprecedented in the history of anti-drug law enforcement efforts. As Rubio prepared for what he knew would be the most important day of his political career, he received another encrypted message from the cartel. This one contained more specific threats and included photographs of his children taken outside their schools, proving that the cartel had been conducting surveillance despite the security measures that had been implemented. The images were clearly intended to terrorize Rubio into submission, but they actually provided law enforcement with valuable intelligence about cartel capabilities and methods. Rodriguez's technical teams immediately began analyzing the photographs for location data, camera signatures, and other forensic evidence that could be used to identify the surveillance operative. By 9 a.m., as Rubio left his secure location for the drive to Capitol Hill, federal agents had already begun arresting cartel associates based on intelligence gathered from the threat communication. The senator's apparent willingness to negotiate had encouraged the cartel to expand their communications and expose more of their network than they had intended. As his armored vehicle approached the Hart Senate office building, Rubio received a final message from Rodriguez, confirming that all teams were in position and ready to execute the largest coordinated anti-cartel operation in history. The hearing room was packed with reporters, congressional staff, and law enforcement officials, who had gathered to witness what most of them expected to be a routine presentation of evidence about drug trafficking. None of them realized that they were about to witness the beginning of an operation that would destroy the most powerful criminal organization in the Western Hemisphere and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of government on both sides of the border.
As Rubio took his seat at the committee table and prepared to begin the hearing that would make history, he thought about the encrypted threat that had arrived just hours earlier. The cartel had attempted to intimidate him into silence, but they had instead provided him with exactly the opportunity he needed to destroy them completely. The hunter had become the hunted, and Eduardo Valdez was about to learn that threatening an American senator's family was the biggest mistake of his criminal career. The next few hours would determine whether justice could triumph over corruption, whether democracy could overcome organized crime, and whether one senator's courage could make the difference in a battle that had been raging for decades. Marco Rubio was ready for the fight of his life, and he was about to show the world that some threats only made him more determined to see justice done. The legendary response that would follow would not only save his family but would fundamentally change the balance of power between law enforcement and organized crime throughout the Americas.
At exactly 10 a.m. Senator Marco Rubio called the hearing to order with a calm authority that masked the extraordinary drama unfolding behind the scenes. The packed hearing room fell silent as he began speaking, unaware that across 3 countries, hundreds of law enforcement officers were preparing to move against targets that had been identified through months of painstaking investigation. Rubio's opening statement was carefully crafted to appear routine while actually serving as a coded signal to trigger the coordinated operations that would dismantle the Sinaloa Cartel's empire. Today we examine the ongoing threat posed by transnational criminal organizations to American communities and democratic institutions. Rubio began, his voice steady despite the knowledge that cartel operatives might be watching his every word for signs that he intended to proceed despite their threats. The evidence we will present demonstrates a level of corruption and violence that demands immediate and decisive action from all levels of government. As Rubio spoke these words, DEA agent Rodriguez was monitoring communications from a secure command center 3 blocks away, watching as cartel communications networks lit up with frantic messages as their leadership realized that the hearing was proceeding as scheduled. The encrypted threat that had been sent to intimidate Rubio into submission had instead provided law enforcement with a direct line into the cartel's operational communications, allowing them to monitor the organization's real-time reactions and adjust their own tactical responses accordingly. The first witness called to testify was Dr. Maria Santos, a forensic accountant who had spent 2 years analyzing financial records seized from cartel money laundering operations. Her testimony would expose the sophisticated methods used by the Sinaloa organization to move billions of dollars through legitimate financial institutions while corrupting bank officials and regulatory authorities on both sides of the border. As Dr. Santos began describing the intricate web of shell companies and fraudulent transactions that formed the backbone of the cartel's financial empire, federal agents in Phoenix were already executing search warrants at banks and businesses that had been identified as key components of the money laundering network. The Sinaloa organization operates with the sophistication of a multinational corporation, Dr. Santos testified, presenting charts and documents that detailed the cartel's financial operations. They have established legitimate businesses across multiple industries that serve as fronts for money laundering activities, while simultaneously corrupting officials within regulatory agencies to ensure that their operations continue without interference. As her testimony continued, Rubio received discreet updates through an encrypted earpiece about the progress of the coordinated law enforcement operations. In Los Angeles, FBI agents had arrested 3 bank executives who had been facilitating cartel money transfers. In Miami, immigration officials had detained a network of cartel operatives who had been using fraudulent documents to transport drugs and personnel across international borders. In Mexico City, federal police were surrounding the luxury hotel where Eduardo Valdez's top lieutenant had been conducting business meetings with corrupted government officials. But the most significant operation was taking place in Sinaloa, where Mexican federal forces were preparing to assault Valdez's heavily fortified compound. Intelligence gathered from the cartel's threatening communications had revealed that the cartel leader was personally directing the intimidation campaign against Rubio, providing law enforcement with confirmation of his location and his direct involvement in the threats against an American senator's family. This represented a significant escalation in the charges that could be brought against Valdez, transforming him from a drug trafficking suspect into someone who had committed acts of terrorism against American government officials. The second witness was Agent Patricia Rodriguez herself, testifying under heavy security protection about the evidence she had gathered during years of undercover operations. Her appearance in the hearing room represented an enormous personal risk, as her testimony would essentially end her career as an undercover operative while making her a permanent target for cartel retaliation. But Rodriguez understood that the operation they had planned represented the best opportunity in decades to strike a decisive blow against organized crime, and she was prepared to sacrifice her own career to see justice done. The Sinaloa Cartel has systematically corrupted American institutions through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and violence. Rodriguez testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed these crimes firsthand. They have placed operatives within law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and government offices at every level, creating a network of protection that has allowed them to operate with virtual impunity for over 2 decades. As Rodriguez presented evidence of specific acts of corruption, including recorded conversations and documented payments to American officials, Rubio watched the real-time intelligence updates flowing through his encrypted communication device. The coordinated operations were proceeding flawlessly, with arrests and seizures occurring simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. The cartel's leadership was being systematically dismantled while their financial assets were being frozen and their operational capabilities were being destroyed. At 11:15 a.m., Rodriguez received a coded message indicating that Mexican federal forces had begun their assault on Valdez's compound. The cartel leader had been trapped inside his fortified facility with a small group of bodyguards, and initial reports suggested that he was attempting to destroy evidence while negotiating for safe passage to a country without extradition treaties with the United States. But the compound was completely surrounded, and communications intercepts indicated that Valdez was becoming increasingly desperate as he realized the scope of the operation being conducted against his organization. The third witness was former cartel operative Miguel Herrera, who had agreed to testify in exchange for entry into the federal witness protection program. Herrera had served as a mid-level manager in the cartel's American operations for 8 years before becoming disillusioned with the organization's increasing violence and deciding to cooperate with law enforcement. His testimony provided detailed information about the cartel's operational methods, including their recruitment of American citizens to serve as operatives and their systematic targeting of law enforcement officials who posed threats to their activities. The cartel maintains detailed intelligence files on American politicians, judges, and law enforcement officers. Herrera testified, describing the organization's sophisticated surveillance and intelligence gathering capabilities. They identify potential threats to their operations years in advance and develop specific strategies for neutralizing those threats through corruption, intimidation, or elimination. This testimony was particularly significant because it provided direct evidence of the cartel's threatening communications with Senator Rubio, establishing the legal foundation for federal terrorism charges against the organization's leadership. The encrypted messages that had been sent to intimidate Rubio represented clear violations of federal anti-terrorism statutes, and Herrera's testimony about the cartel's systematic targeting of American officials demonstrated a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple drug trafficking. As the hearing continued, updates from the law enforcement operations became increasingly dramatic. In Texas, federal agents had seized a massive cache of weapons and drugs from cartel safehouses, including military-grade equipment that the organization had been smuggling across the border for use in territorial conflicts with rival groups. In California, banking regulators had frozen over $2 billion in assets linked to cartel money laundering operations, effectively crippling the organization's ability to move funds through legitimate financial channels. But the most significant development came at 12:30 p.m., when Rodriguez received confirmation that Eduardo Valdez had been captured alive during the assault on his compound. The cartel leader had surrendered when Mexican forces breached his final defensive position, realizing that continued resistance would result in his death and the destruction of records that might be used to negotiate a plea agreement with American prosecutors. His capture represented the culmination of the largest coordinated anti-cartel operation in law enforcement history, and his eventual extradition to the United States would provide prosecutors with the opportunity to seek justice for decades of drug trafficking, corruption, and violence. As news of Valdez's capture began circulating through law enforcement channels, the remaining cartel leadership structure began collapsing in real time. Lower-level operatives, realizing that their organization's protection network had been destroyed, began surrendering to authorities and offering to cooperate with investigations in exchange for reduced sentences. Financial institutions, faced with evidence of their employees' corruption, began implementing emergency measures to prevent further money laundering activities. Government officials who had been compromised by cartel money began quietly resigning from their positions rather than face criminal prosecution for their cooperation with the criminal organization. By 2:00 p.m., as the hearing entered its final phase, the scope of the law enforcement victory had become clear. Over 300 arrests had been made across multiple countries, with cartel operatives and their corrupted allies being taken into custody in coordinated operations that had been timed to prevent any of the targets from warning others or fleeing to avoid prosecution. Assets worth over $8 billion had been seized or frozen, representing the largest financial blow ever struck against organized crime in the Western Hemisphere. Most importantly, the cartel's leadership structure had been completely destroyed, with Eduardo Valdez and his top lieutenants now in custody facing charges that would likely result in life sentences without the possibility of parole. As Rubio prepared to deliver his closing statement, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. The encrypted threat that had arrived at his phone just hours earlier had been intended to terrorize him into abandoning his investigation, but it had instead provided the final piece of evidence needed to bring down the most powerful criminal organization in the Americas. The cartel leadership had fatally underestimated both his determination and the sophistication of the law enforcement operation that had been planned to destroy their empire. Today's testimony has exposed the true scope of the threat posed by transnational criminal organizations to American security and democratic institutions. Rubio began his closing statement, speaking not just to the hearing room but to the millions of Americans who were watching the proceedings on television. But more importantly, today's coordinated law enforcement operations have demonstrated that these criminal enterprises, no matter how powerful or sophisticated they may appear, are not beyond the reach of justice. When law enforcement agencies work together with the support and oversight of democratic institutions. As Rubio spoke these words, he was receiving real-time updates about the continuing success of the operations. In Mexico, Eduardo Valdez was being transported under heavy guard to a secure facility where he would await extradition proceedings that would bring him to the United States to face charges for his threats against an American senator and his family. The cartel leader who had once seemed untouchable was now just another criminal defendant facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in an American federal prison. The hearing concluded at 3:30 p.m. with a standing ovation from the gallery, as reporters and congressional staff recognized that they had witnessed one of the most significant law enforcement victories in modern American history. But for Rubio, the real satisfaction came from a secure phone call he received minutes after the hearing ended. His wife and children, who had been living under protective custody for weeks, were now safe to return home. The threats that had been hanging over his family had been eliminated, along with the criminal organization that had issued them. Over the following weeks, as the full scope of the operation became public, Marco Rubio was widely praised for his courage in confronting the cartel threats, while maintaining the security of a complex law enforcement operation. Editorial writers across the country compared his actions to those of prosecutors who had taken on organized crime in previous generations, noting that his willingness to put his own family at risk had been essential to the success of the operation. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the communities that had been most directly affected by cartel violence and drug trafficking. In cities across America where cartel operations had been dismantled, local officials reported immediate decreases in drug-related crime and violence. Parents whose children had been victims of cartel-supplied drugs wrote letters thanking Rubio for his courage in taking on such dangerous adversaries. Law enforcement officers who had been fighting cartels for years without adequate support from political leaders expressed their gratitude for finally having a senator willing to provide the resources and political backing needed to achieve decisive victories. The legal proceedings that followed would continue for years, as prosecutors worked through the massive amount of evidence that had been gathered and the hundreds of defendants who had been arrested during the coordinated operations. Eduardo Valdez eventually pled guilty to multiple federal charges, including terrorism-related offenses for his threats against Senator Rubio's family, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His cooperation with prosecutors led to additional arrests and convictions of corrupted officials throughout the government and private sector. The financial impact of the operation was equally significant. The billions of dollars in assets that were seized from cartel operations were used to fund anti-drug programs, victim compensation funds, and enhanced law enforcement capabilities. The money laundering networks that had been exposed and dismantled were replaced with enhanced regulatory systems that made it much more difficult for criminal organizations to move large amounts of illicit funds through legitimate financial institutions. But perhaps the most important long-term impact was the precedent that had been established for future anti-crime operations. The coordination between congressional oversight and law enforcement action that Rubio had pioneered became a model for subsequent efforts to combat organized crime, terrorism, and corruption. The willingness of a political leader to accept personal risk in order to achieve justice sent a powerful message to both criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies about what could be accomplished when democratic institutions functioned as they were intended to function. Years later, when asked about the events that had transformed him from a rising political figure into a national hero, Rubio would always emphasize the teamwork and coordination that had made the operation possible. He would point out that the victory over the Sinaloa Cartel had been achieved not through individual heroism, but through the careful planning and professional execution of hundreds of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and intelligence analysts who had worked for months to develop and implement a strategy that could overcome years of cartel infiltration and corruption. The encrypted message that had arrived at 3:47 a.m. on that fateful morning had been intended as the ultimate intimidation tactic, a threat so direct and personal that any rational politician would have immediately backed down from confronting such dangerous adversaries. Instead, it had become the catalyst for the most successful anti-crime operation in American law enforcement history, proving that democratic institutions, when properly supported and courageously led, remained more powerful than even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. Eduardo Valdez had built his empire on the assumption that American politicians could be intimidated or corrupted into allowing his operations to continue without serious interference. His decision to threaten Marco Rubio's family had been based on decades of experience in successfully neutralizing political threats through violence and intimidation. But he had fundamentally miscalculated both the character of the senator he was threatening and the capabilities of the law enforcement agencies that were prepared to support congressional efforts to combat organized crime. The legendary response that became known as the Rubio Operation would be studied for generations as an example of how courage, preparation, and coordination could overcome seemingly insurmountable criminal enterprises. It demonstrated that in America no criminal organization, no matter how wealthy or powerful or sophisticated, was beyond the reach of justice when political leaders were willing to accept the personal risks necessary to defend democratic institutions and protect innocent citizens from organized crime. The threat had been intended to silence one senator, but instead it had awakened an entire system of justice that had been waiting for the right moment and the right leadership to strike back against decades of criminal impunity. Marco Rubio's legendary response had not only saved his family but had fundamentally changed the balance of power between law enforcement and organized crime throughout the Americas, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to surrender in the face of the most serious threats.